Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. Welcome. Today is Wednesday, August 19th. It is the Facebook Live Ask Me Anything with the InfoMullet. I am Timothy Clancy, your Chief Mulleteer, and this is Bonky, the Emotional Support Donkey, which I am going to need because I have worked 46 days in a row without a break. Last day I had off, I think, was July 4th. So I'm getting this done today. I just submitted a few articles for my research, tying up a few things at work, and then hopefully being able to manage some time. So we got a full day today. If you haven't yet, follow the InfoMullet Facebook page, which you're watching this on. If you're watching it later in YouTube, click that subscribe button. All the sources that I talk about are in the comments of the Facebook Live meeting, and they're also going to be down below in that first comment section of YouTube. So check it out. Welcome to everyone who's joined. I wanted to get started. Our first thing is, when we polled the mulleteers about what they wanted to see, they wanted to still get more research and more tools to help them sort of individualize their COVID-19 understanding. Clearly with wave 1.5, we're still struggling at it. It's been 18 days in August. We've had 18,000 deaths, over 18,000 deaths. So we're pushing over 1,000 dead every day on average over the last 18. So we're still struggling with it. And people are looking for more tools and choices about as they have to confront going back to school, or they're going to college, or they're having to work at a school or a college, or they're looking at business. They want to understand, how can I calculate risk and understand that? So the first thing I want to do, and it ties in with some of what we're going to do, is National Geographic has released a pretty good interactive tool, which measures the risk of airborne COVID-19 in office, classroom, bus ride, things like that. So the link for this is down below. And what it does is it has some settings here that you can adjust. And these are all adjustable. You go in an area, you put the percent in. I'm just going to go through an overview and then show you how to do this. Your percent of population that's infected, you're wearing a mask, what percent of the time, be honest, and have visited this area how many times. See, this is an area I like about this model because it assumes that we're not just doing a one-off event. You know, if the world was full of one-off events, pandemics would be a lot different, but we have to do certain things each day, and therefore exposure and risk accumulates as a factor over time. So if you think about this broadly, and I'll get through the rest of this, I only have a 1% chance of being affected if I do this X thing. Well, if you do that X thing 100 times, you have a 1% chance each time you do it. That doesn't mean that you're 100% likely to get it. That's not how probability works. But it certainly risks that 1% a whole lot of times, and the accumulated risk adds up. So they go through this, how many times have you visited this place or participated? How much space is between people? These are now being published a lot for workplaces and schools, their targeted space. And how many of the other people are wearing a mask, and what percent effective is that mask? And then it calculates it across 6 different things. An indoor gathering is what they describe as sort of a poorly ventilated, pervasive talking environment. Think of this as probably going to be the worst case scenario. Your energy efficient office, moderate talking, moderate movement. Classroom, they put a classroom in here. Outdoor activity, jogging, running, things like that. Subway ride, I know a lot of people are concerned about public transportation and bus rides. So you can actually model each one of these and see what your accumulated risk. Oh, and they also at the bottom of the chart, so each chart shows a percent likelihood of infection over the hours you spend in that exposure. So if you're in a classroom for only 20 minutes, that's a lot different than being in a classroom for 3 hours. And they preloaded a couple ones here at the bottom, which is like, if you're in a well-fitted mask, and there's, versus no masks, and they're showing these over 20 times of scenarios. So what they're showing here is, when you read this, this is saying if for 20 times you spend 3 hours in one of these activities with no masks in an area that's having an outbreak, you can see here the chance of infection's fairly high. And this is a good tool for testing. If your school sends information and says, this is the feat, I'm going to calculate this now for North Carolina because Chapel Hill's in the news. But first of all, people are like, how do I know the percent population infected? Most reporting now will give you a 7-day moving average of the daily new cases per 100,000 cases. And it's pretty simple. 1,000 per 100,000 is 1%. But you need to remember that that's the daily new, and people are infectious for 14 to 20 days. So what you need to do is take that daily 7-day moving average new daily case rate, multiply it by 14 or 20 times, and from that, then you take that as 100,000. So I did that for Chapel Hill, which I'm just picking out. Let's say they're about 1.5. We're going to assume that I'm a student wearing a mask that's 50% of effective, but I'm in a college environment. Maybe I'm getting 10 feet per square here, and other people are not wearing masks, right? So you can begin to see, if I'm in an indoor gathering that's not well ventilated, my chance of getting enough airborne contagion over 20 times, because think about it, I'm going to a classroom, right? I'm going to be in a classroom. It's got a lot of people. We're sitting in desks. I'm going to be there at least 20 times over the course of the semester. You can see it's rising here. Not all classes are 3 hours, obviously, but you can begin to play around with these numbers to understand where the risk is and what difference masking effectiveness makes. By the way, 1% is about average right now in a lot of the outbreaks. A 3% is considered a hot spot. So if you're living in a hot spot, you need to account for being in 3%. And if you aren't wearing a mask, you can see here how the risks go. Even if others are wearing a mask, the risk for you goes way up. So this is kind of a good model to, and it's National Geographic, so I'm kind of trusting them here, but it's a good model for calculating individual risks. And the accumulation of risks, because it's not enough to say, well, I'm just doing this one thing. It's like, okay, you're going to work every day. You're going to be in this spot for how many hours per day, and over 20 days or 50 days or 70 days. This gets into what I'm calling the lost year that's sitting ahead for schools and universities. So about a month ago, I did 2 models, one of which was on universities and the other of which is on schools, showing that the push to return to normalcy, which was evident in the summer, that we're going to reopen schools, we're going to go back to normal, we're going to return school to normal, has led to the same dynamic we saw with the push to return to normalcy for businesses. And that means a hasty reopening that was ill-advised with these conditions that I just modeled talking about are resulting in infections and quarantines and disruptions, which are at the very least removing the normalcy you were seeking to have. And in worst case, some of these places are reversing and shutting down and closing the schools. And this has happened now in a bunch of high schools that started opening late, that had early openings, they were early August. Georgia got on the news, of course, because Georgia did. There was a school that had a packed hallway. I mean, that last model was 8 feet. This was not even 30 inches between people. It's packed with students. No one's wearing a mask. Hardly anyone's wearing a mask. There was a lot of hubbub about, well, the students should be sharing these images on media. They were going to get in trouble. Boom, a week later, that school district has closed because of the outbreak of cases. University of Chapel Hill. Now Chapel Hill is not a small university. This is 20,000 students, and they opened early. They were allowing students to move in. This is when they're doing it. And it didn't take long. That model I showed you a month ago was over the course of a semester. This is in 2 weeks. They had a positivity rate of their testing. It went from 2.8% to 13.6%. Remember, that positivity rate when you're testing is an indicator of how widespread the outbreak is. And as of this morning, and this is the press announcement, they had not over 1,000 students in isolation. They've tested 1,000 students, excuse me. Close to 200 were in isolation and 400 were in quarantine. So of a student population of 20,000, within the first week, 500, or about 2.5% of your population, is already now in isolation or quarantine. And they're saying, fortunately, most of our students who have tested positive have demonstrated mild symptoms. Well, that's symptoms. That's going to be reasonable. We know that the breakdown is, 80% are going to be mild, some percent, maybe even with that young age, 90% are going to be mild. But what we don't know is the long-term effects. And when they say, yeah, most of our students are mild, even if it's 1%, you just had 5 students who went in a hospital, maybe 10 students, maybe 20 students hospitalized. And so what you're seeing universities now do is University of Chapel Hill reversed. They're going online. They said, well, we tried this. It lasted about a week, and now all undergraduate classes are going online. And you're seeing this effect play out across the nation, both in schools, and I use schools to kind of talk about high school, primary, secondary, high school, middle school, elementary, and universities, colleges, things like that. And I think it's going to continue to play out because remember, we're just the first weekend. This is an accumulative risk. As you continue this exposure over time, as we're in an environment of outbreak, a school that opens fine and doesn't have a problem this week is still going to be worried about it next week and the week after. And I think what's going to happen, yeah, people are pointing out that in that model, if you have 6 hours of classes in a day and that school is not well prepared, you're virtually guaranteed to get, if there's an infection in the community, you're going to get a high risk of infection. It's just not feasible. And when I say the lost year, this isn't just the classroom size. A bunch of conferences, college sports conferences, have basically shut down their seasons. And this is both out of concern for the athletes, the concern that they can't reliably get people in the stadiums to watch the games, they can't safely hold them. They're going to be, this lost year is going to play out in a lot of ways. The first way is obviously students are going to challenge and learn because a lot of universities, when they should have been preparing for online learning, or some sort of separated cohort approach where the people who needed essential services, those were the only ones coming in person and the rest was online learning. They didn't put that investment in time in. They bought into this normalcy and they kind of, we're going to go forward and give it a try. They gave it a try. And now abruptly they're having to shift back to online learning. Well, go back and think about your workplace when your workplace had to go online in March in a week or two. They're going to lose 3 to 4 weeks just getting everything online and dealing with this. I mean, I have a feeling that this semester is pretty much a lost semester because we've done this rush to reopen. We're going to have this, and it's because there's no nationwide response. Every state, college, and school is going to make these choices individually. A school may get all the way into October and then have to shut down or then have to modify. It's not going to all be in the first month here, but I'm still suspecting that before this first semester is open, you're going to have so much chaos and turbulence that you're going to basically have a lost semester. And this isn't just lost in terms of school outcomes and education and learning and risk. There's a lot of pressure on revenue from parents who are like, why am I paying this much tuition for all online? There's not going to be any sports revenue. I suspect that by this time next year, we may be talking about a collapse of the college bubble where there's, at least for universities and colleges, they've been relying for years. We've talked in the past about foreign students paying high levels of tuition. They've been relying on sports revenues to a large degree. They have very high costs, which are very hard to justify in the best of times. Now they can't. And then all these additional expenses they're putting in place to be safe, only to find out you can't have a picnic safely in the middle of the forest fire. I think it's going to be a real financial shock to the system as this plays out over the next year. Now, maybe things will get better and we'll have a better outcome, but I don't think so because seasonally, we just got through the best time of the year, right? If you think about what's the best time of the year to have a pandemic, it's not, it's behind us, right? We're now going into the worst time of the year to have a pandemic, especially when you talk about schools and universities, because what happens beginning in October, November, December is the flu season begins. Right now, I've showed it before that the CDC chart, the earliest the flu season starts usually in October, then November. Most often it starts December, January. So if the schools are closed down by that point, I think there's a lot less risk. But we're going to be overlaying this wave 1.5, possibly wave 2, on top of a flu season, which historically we've been getting better, but 2018, which is the last date I have, was one of the worst years on recent records. So there's like these risks. If we have a bad flu season on top of a pandemic, you're talking about that curve scenario where you've failed to flatten the curve going out all over the place. So the good times are behind us. Hope you enjoyed the good times as far as the pandemic comes. The hard times are coming up ahead. And I don't think, again, we've really grasped this, what we need to do. And I'm going to go to some comments here. People mocking me for using statistics. Usually I'm in favor of calculus, but when appropriate, statistics are fine. Jennifer talking about the long-term effects are scary. Right, yeah. You know, we don't know, with the novel virus, we don't know what the long-term effects are. People talking about lost time to prepare and not using it. And somebody selling looks like a prepaid phone or something. Yeah, so by the way, if you're watching this now or later on YouTube, there's a special prize if you can identify the herpes salesman who keeps just showing up in our comments and adding special comments to find a cure for herpes. It's one of the weird things when you're running a YouTube channel, you don't realize just how much spam there is until you have to go in and clear it out. Yeah, get the flu vaccine, right? We've talked about masks, and now we're back into that annual fight of, do I get flu vaccinated? Get your flu vaccine. Do everything you can this year to keep the flu as minimal as possible, because that's going to hit right on top of the pandemic, and it's going to be a bad situation overall. Now, one of the things that people have been trying to sort of soften this blow on is saying, well, you know, we're struggling, we're going through this, but eventually we're going to get some herd immunity. And I hate to bring up Sweden. Every time I bring up Sweden, I get angry Swedes on my YouTube channel. All my YouTube videos usually get 20 to 30 views. When I mention Sweden, it's up to like 500, and they all hate me personally. So I'm now speaking a week ahead of time. When the angry Swedes are now watching this on YouTube, understand I'm not picking on you out of any agenda. I'm not picking you out of like, I don't like Sweden. I think Sweden's a fine country. I have lots of friends who are Swedish. You know, it's like, but the reason that Sweden has become an example is it's one of the few countries still experimenting with this induced herd immunity. And I know they don't want to call it induced herd immunity. They want to call it something else. And it's okay. You know, when we started this in March, we all had different pandemic national responses, and this is why I tracked them. I was a supporter of something called the voluntary fire break. No one remembers that, but I used to say, hey, I think we should do a voluntary fire break where businesses voluntarily shut down or move online. Festivals like Coachella and concerts, they voluntarily shut down. It was called the voluntary fire break, and I was an advocate in mid-March. That horse is not only dead, but glue that's been used a long time ago for a paste project, right? I gave up on that pandemic response because it clearly wasn't working. This is a novel virus. We're going to have to find the best evidence-based systems we can. And the thing you can't do in a pandemic, you can't make a death pact with your first choice, right? You can't get so stuck on a strategy that you're not willing to adjust based on the evidence. And where Sweden comes up is it's got this kind of commitment, regardless of what the evidence is, that things are going to be okay, things are going to be fine. Because even if we had more people die than any other Baltic country and the economy tanked and we weren't able to protect the elders, at the end of it, we're going to get herd immunity. You know, we're going to have herd immunity. No one else is. Well, a research just came out from the Royal Journal of Medicine, and it doesn't look good. So sorry, Sweden, for those who are going to be really upset with what I have to say. Again, I'm not picking on your agenda, but as someone who, as a country which stuck with the tactic of induced herd immunity as an outlier amongst your neighbors, you're now the placebo case, right? You're the one who didn't get the medicine. So we're using you as an example to say, well, what happens if they didn't put in place? And the estimates, so when we talk about herd immunity, there's a debate that's going on. Classically, people will say you need to between 60 and 80% of the population. There's some models that are going on that saying, well, maybe we can get away with 50%. You know, people are juggling numbers around. Sweden initially projected that they would get a 40% seroconversion, which is, you know, antibody, in Stockholm by May of 2020. So they, you know, not necessarily 50, 60, 70%, but a good chunk, 40%. And they certainly had an outbreak in Sweden to, you know, test that theory. Well, the articles and the links, they didn't found any good news. So what they're found is that it's basically right now, I think in Sweden, it's about 15% antibodies. So instead of being 40%, it's 15%. And the reason why they found this, and it's let me share this graphic here, because they looked at a bunch of different countries here. Here's the meta study. Again, I only try and do research that combines the results of many studies. I'm not trying to do individual ones, but they had the country and the city that the study was done in, the date. This row here is your key. This is your percent antibodies and what population was tested. And the reference citation, again, in the paper, this is the footnote. So you can see these studies here. First of all, no country's near herd immunity, right? The highest level country or the situation, New York City. You would think if any place had herd immunity, it'd be New York City with the super spreader event they had in April. They had, excuse me, March and April. They tested it in May, June. New York City only has 21% herd resistance, right? That's a problem for the herd immunity theory. If your worst case scenario of a city outbreak hasn't gained half of what your herd immunity is, all the rest of these are less. And that's not a good sign. And part of the research shows, and this is the part that's kind of disturbing, is it's showing that all of these mild and asymptomatic cases, remember when I said earlier in the college that, Chapel Hill is like, hey, these are asymptomatic. So the students, they're not necessarily hurt. I wanted to key in on that phrase because what this research shows that I haven't seen done before is it says, if you get a mild and asymptomatic case, chances are you're not going to gain resistance. And that's a very big difference than I think the mental model people had that said, well, lots of people are getting it. Some are having bad outcomes, but a lot of people are asymptomatic, and that will help the general cause for herd immunity. What this research seems to show is that that's not the case. I may have herd immunity because I didn't have a mild case. I had a moderate case. Some people would call it severe. But even my immunity, they speculate, even if you have it, it may be 3 or 6 months or at most a year. It's not going to be this herd immunity that I think people want, this panacea where we'll get herd immunity absent a vaccine. And now people, so let's go to some of the questions here. Jerry Spalding, quote, I don't like Sweden, the infomullet. Ed, I prefer calculus, but Sweden is okay. Look, don't even get me started on Swedish history because Sweden has a lot of good things going for it. But Charles XII, making that decision to go in the Ukraine, I can't understand it. That's the thing I'm talking about, right? If your strategy is not working, Charles, Chuck, Sweden, listen to me. If your strategy is not working and you're heading to Moscow and you're in the middle of the Ukraine and your supply train's way behind you, turn around, go back home. It doesn't work out well. And that's what I'm afraid, Sweden right now, to their credit, like all the Baltic countries, has a low daily case rate. So in some ways, yes, the current wave's over. The concerns that I'm rising, not just for Sweden, but for the US, because certainly we're no great example, is this isn't over. Wave 2 is coming, right? We're in the middle of wave 1.5. Wave 2 is coming. These things will come in wave. And if you haven't learned the proper pandemic response by now, you're going to get hammered when this wave 2 shows up on top of the flu, the annual flu outbreak. Yeah, Trisha's now mentioning here another possible result of the hasty reopening of schools is the loss of teachers who will leave the profession due to being asked to do the possible. Right, there's burnout. There's I don't want to risk my life. This is too much to ask me to do. I've been asked to do so much with so little for years. Now I'm being asked to do more. Herd immunity threshold dependent on the R-OT of the disease. So Trisha, this gets into a somewhat complicated, but if you imagine 3 stocks of population, the susceptible, the infected, and the recovered, and assume the recovered have a immunity, what you're looking about is when we talk about herd immunity, the susceptible are the people who can get it, the infected are the ones who can give it to them. Based on the dynamics of how those two populations interact, there's a ratio within which, and you got to think about how long you have the disease, how visible it is you have the disease, and how long it takes the disease from an infected to go to recovered. So there's a couple parameters in there, but basically there's a ratio that exists for every disease that says if there's not enough susceptible people nearby to spread to that infected. So it's the R-OT assumes the R-OT value assumes that these people are within range to spread, but things that are like social distancing or quarantine of the sick or other measures can reduce that available population within which it will spread to. So it's really about a ratio between that susceptible and infected stock. And the problem, what we're hearing now when we do these stocks, I may use a simulation model in a future one, but if you were infected and recovered, at least it looks like for COVID-19, if you were mild or asymptomatic, you go back to susceptible because you don't have herd immunity, or you don't have antibodies, you don't have built-in resistance. And even if you have built-in resistance like me, if it wears off, you go back in susceptible. So there's a flow back into the susceptible stock from the infected stock. Good discussion here. The study is the, let me pull it here. The study is listed in the notes here. Got to scroll down. Just had it here. Jules is asking for the actual name of the study. Pull it up. I've got the DOI link. Here we go. Journal of Royal Society of Medicine. The study is called 4 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, Sweden's prized herd immunity is nowhere in sight. I didn't want to read that title because now I'm going to get plus 20 angry Swedes just for saying prized herd immunity is nowhere in sight. But that's the name of the title. The DOI link is in the comments. Yeah, and Jennifer brings up mutations. Science Decoded, Lucas Hill, who is a muleteer, Science Decoded, I've got the link in there. This is another Facebook group that I recommend. Lucas does a lot of work in laboratories with COVID-19. He's taking a deeper scientific dive than I do. He gets into things like mutations and genetic variations and things like that. So I'd check out his Facebook page if you haven't. Yeah, and now we've gone to jokes on the Swedish chef, which is only going to get me in more trouble. So that's, I mean, again, it's not, the herd immunity thing isn't limited to Sweden, but it's the case study of Sweden chose a path where if you're going to see herd immunity, I mean, in an alternate universe, Sweden might have made the best choice. In an alternate universe, Charles II, 12th may have captured Moscow and defeated Peter the Great, but that's not the universe we live in. So again, any pandemic response, whether it's the US thoughts and prayers or the Swedish approach of herd immunity or any of these other things, you cannot make a death pact with your first strategy. You have to be willing to change it and adjust it based off the evidence. So let's switch a little gears here to the stimulus update. So last time we were on, there was a lot of concern about what was going on with the stimulus negotiations. Well, I can report there are no stimulus negotiations because Congress went home and the president signed an executive order. Two of the elements of that executive order, again, the links for this are down, are not, I mean, it was kind of a halfway measure with a limited time duration. And so one of the things, the two main elements that people were looking for was an extension of the unemployment benefits above and beyond the payment amount, the amount you made from the job. There was an additional $600 a week provided by the federal government, and this was considered key for not just making people whole for the lost job, but helping for the downturn in the economy. Again, this is very different. There's no moral hazard question when it comes to a pandemic. It's a crater. It's like a meteorite hit the US, right? Or an army invaded. You have to fill the hole. So even though I am fiscally conservative, I'm generally in favor of things like this because that's the role of, in emergency situations, that's a valid, legitimate role of government. Well, it was $600 a week, and there were various competing proposals. The Democrats wanted to keep that $600 a week through January. The Republicans wanted to drop it to $400 a week and drop it further. Neither side agreed, so the president signed an executive order, and that one did a real tricky thing. It said states can choose to a $300 or $400 extra a week, but the state would have to chip in $100 if they went for the 400 option, and the funding that would come from this is not guaranteed for the entire duration of which it's supposed to be. And so there's a lot going in there. Let's unpack this. Because the president has limited authority, he was trying to navigate, well, he or whoever put it together was staying within the authorities he had. And so the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, is the one administering this unemployment program because why not? We have, we'll put FEMA in charge of unemployment. That makes sense. But anyways, FEMA's administering this program. There's a bucket of money. States have to sign up for it. And once they sign up, they're on the hook for paying for the duration of the employments, even if the money in FEMA's bucket runs out. They also can decide, are they just going to take the $300 a week federal, or are they going to do the $400 where they have to put $100 in? And so the Associated Press did a survey of the states. And as of this last Monday, 18 states have said they'll take the federal grants and they'll start issuing unemployment. I haven't heard of any unemployment being issued yet in that regard, so the money's still coming through. but 30 states are still evaluating, and 2 have said no. And this is not a partisan thing. It's a fairly bipartisan. You've got, you know, in North Carolina, there's the Democratic governor wanting to get the $400 plan, but the Republican lawmakers in the state weren't, the legislature, which needed to pass it, they weren't sure they were able to, back the amount that this would cost the state. And that's a problem. These state budgets have been absolutely hammered by the pandemic. Sales tax is down, all sorts of tax and revenue is down, and they're having to sustain all this unemployment. And, Mississippi, the Republican governor of Mississippi just said, no, it's too expensive altogether. They can't afford it. They're not doing it. These states are getting to the point where they're having to, we talked very early on about states needing to use the federal as a backstop for loaning money to afford the unemployment because their funds were not well funded. And we did a map of, I think it was like 30 something states didn't have sufficient funding. Well, now 6 months into this, 10 states are now actively taking loans just to pay the state benefits. This isn't the thing on top of it. And another 8 states have received authorization for loans but haven't used it yet. So we're looking right now, basically 14 states are on unemployment life insurance where they're borrowing the money from the federal government to pay the state level unemployment benefits to the people because their funds that they had weren't built up enough prior to the pandemic, even though we had a very long run from the last financial crash. You think 2012 to 2018 or 2019, that was your period to rebuild your reserves. Very few states did that. The second big part of that executive order was the payroll tax deferral. And I'm using the word deferral very intentionally because the president does not have the authority to waive the payroll tax. Only Congress can, and specifically the House, because the House controls the purse. If you look in the Constitution, all revenue-related bills have to start with the House. But the president can issue a deferral that you don't have to collect it at a point in time. So what the executive order would do is it set a 2-part opt-in. One, businesses would first have to opt in, and then second, employees themselves would have to opt in. And if they opt in, their payroll tax portion, which is usually about 7.5% of their income up to the Medicare max, which is like 106,000, 108,000, something like that. That part they wouldn't pay now. It would be deferred until a tax bill next year. And this is the key part. It's not free money. It's basically a no interest loan with a due date a year out. Now, this is done in part because I think the president believes that when Congress comes back, they will simply waive the payroll tax for this period, and so you wouldn't have to pay it back. But not unexpectedly, the businesses have rejected this. I mean, we're talking now about, let me list them here, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Retail Federation, and the National Association of Manufacturers. These are large, very well representative business lobby groups. They've said no. They've encouraged their members not to accept this payroll because they think it's unfair to their employees to basically, hey, you're getting this free money, but you're going to have to pay it a year later. Plus, implementing the systems where you have now an opt-in at the business and an opt-in at the individual is very costly and expensive. And this would all run out within a couple months anyway. So they said, no, get Congress back in session, negotiate the damn stimulus bill, and come to a better solution. So the executive order that the president signed, the 2 main features of it are falling apart right as, the unemployment benefits expired late July, I think it is. And we're heading into this headwinds now, so I think we're going to potentially see some economic hardships here. Let's see here. Questions on that? Okay, I got this guy. I apologize for the spam comments in there. I see. All right, so I knew I had this done for a reason. Pardon me for a second. I'm going to go in here and just ban. Unfortunately, the person is not showing up, Joseph Matubo. So I apologize for those who are getting spam. Just ignore him, put him on block. I'll try and get him banned here in the middle of the. Yep, he's not showing up. So he's got something going on with his name. So thanks for reporting and blocking him. Yep. Ed says, bonus, if you take the deferral and it's not forgiven, there's talk it could be considered 2020 income, which you then have to pay income tax on, as well as paying back the deferred taxes. That's usually how it works. If you defer a tax payment, that counts as, I mean, income counts as income, right? It's not a secret thing. If you get money that's not taxed, that's income. So yeah, you would have to pay income tax on it according to your normal income tax rate. It would, and that varies. But then you would also have to pay the amount back. Thanks everyone for blocking the spammer. I think the Swedes are getting back at me by attacking me with spammers is what I think is going on. With the evictions, Tricia, there's been a, HUD has made an order. So what Tricia's talking about is there was an eviction moratorium that was in place as part of this stimulus package that didn't get renegotiated when Congress left. It's now expired. And I'm not sure if the president ordered it or the HUD secretary ordered it or someone in HUD ordered it, but HUD has the administrative authority to defer evictions across a wide swath. HUD's the Housing and Urban Development. They control the Fair Housing Practices, Fair Housing Acts, and most rental policies flow up underneath them. I saw that they had done an extension on the moratorium, but it wasn't clear with what authority they did it and how long it will last. So I think it's more of a bridging mechanism than it is, and it may only apply to HUD administered properties. I don't know if it's, for example, Section 8 housing and things like that, or it applies broadly. So I'll have to check in and look at that. Is there any chance of getting Congress back to pass a COVID aid bill? In a campaign year? No, I don't think so. Even though no one can campaign. I mean, I'm like, bring Congress back and go do your Zoom chat, in a non-taxpayer funded closet nearby or something like that. I just think given it's a presidential campaign year, I don't think they're going to be back to negotiate. They never got close when they left over the summer. And the Senate and House versions were still pretty far apart. Now, Trump has signaled some willingness to move on certain things, but there's other things he's not willing to move on. So unless it comes back and becomes one of these political campaign footballs where, in addition to just trying to do the parts of the stimulus that's needed, both sides are trying to get a leg up on the other and make the other look bad, I'm not holding out too much hope. Yeah, and Jay's bringing up the $600 kicker was last applied to the week ending July 25th. So we're almost a full month in. Next week will be a full month in for that $600 evaporating. And we're going to see that in increased, a flow effect as it hits the rest of the economy. So that's with the stimulus. So quick change to media spotlight effect. So let's talk about the U.S. mail. Media literacy. What is the spotlight effect? A spotlight effect is when a news story highlights something that could be bad or could be routine, and it's not exclusive to one or the other. That happens all the time in the routine case, but it also now in the media story is being presented as bad. And what happens is the media spotlight shines this giant spotlight and says, this thing is bad. Then everyone goes, oh, that's bad. They start looking for it, and because it happens as a routine course, they see it everywhere. So the spotlight effect is shining a spotlight on something that happens all the time, because maybe there's a legitimately bad thing that happened, but when people go looking for it, they find it, and this creates a feedback effect of, oh my gosh, the really bad thing is really happening. Look at all this evidence we just see, and you see this a lot of times in moral panics. What is a moral panic? A moral panic is a form of social contagion where we feel that our values or our norms or our safety are being threatened, and it spreads like wildfire. So when you combine a spotlight effect with a moral panic, you get a situation that we had with this kind of, and it gets complicated in this case because when we're talking about the post office, we're talking about the removal of mailboxes, the locking of mailboxes, the funding. The president himself set this whole thing into motion, right? This is all something that he set out by consistently slamming mail-in voting when there's zero evidence that the fraud rates are any. I did a check on the stats. It's like 0.01 with times 10 to the negative E. It's so far down. I think the Heritage Foundation did a check on something like 15 million mail-in ballots of Oregon and found 15 that were fraud. Normal campaign fraud, when and where it happens, because it does happen, are almost always local campaign officers. I mean, that's the unsung truth here, is it's the campaign officers and the political parties itself. It rarely involves mail. It rarely involves these dastardly things. It involves campaign officers playing with the things, or more traditional suppression of, removing polling places. But anyways, the president got in this big thing about the mail, and all of a sudden everyone's like, we're seeing the mailboxes removed. It's happening live. This is it. I saw progressives who have never been a Second Amendment supporter in their lives all of a sudden post that a Second Amendment solution was needed for the removal of the mailboxes. And I'm like, hold on, folks. Just before we grab the musket and ride the pony, one by land, two by sea, let's check this, because it's a spotlight effect and a moral panic in the middle of an election year where the president himself is saying, I'm going to interrupt this. So I can understand. But when we look at some of these pictures, let's start first talking about mailbox removals and locking, right? These are the most visual. So these are the kind of pictures that started to grow up. And you see on the top here, the version, Burbank is trending. This picture was in Burbank, right? And this is someone who actually lives in this area. These were saying, have you ever seen a locked mailbox in your life? And really dramatic. And she's like, these have been locked for 2 years. They were locked because ironically, they were locked to provide mail security. There was a problem in after hours with people fishing the mail out of the mailboxes, so they locked them. And I went back and I found the news story from 2 years ago about these mailboxes being locked, and the thief story. It's in the links. Then there's the one, and so this is one of these things where the media spotlight, people, you don't notice this. You drive around all the time. You don't notice the mailboxes are locked, but people live in the area. They're like, okay, those mailboxes get locked. All of a sudden you see it's locked. You see the media telling that the president's going to interfere in the election. The president saying he's going to interfere in the election, and it all blows up. On the right is from Boston, some images from Brighton, and they're like, look, it's happening now. This kind of, it's happening now. The revolution's happening now, and you've got a picture of a truck with some mailboxes. And it's this emotive, evocative language that is key to the moral panic. Our values are being attacked. It's happening now. You have to do something. But notice what's on the side of this mailbox, this graffiti mark here. So when you dig into managing mailboxes, there is a constant removal and replacement of mailboxes for 3 reasons. 1, they get damaged. 2, they get tagged with graffiti. And 3, it's a low volume area. So all the time, you're talking about tens of thousands of mailboxes across the United States. They're constantly being removed and being replaced with new ones that aren't tagged with graffiti, or they're being removed because it's a low volume area. So this is a constant thing happening. But now the media spotlight drops in on top of it. And I included the Boston, there's a local Boston story explaining how the post office had described months ago that they were going to remove the graffiti tagged mailboxes as part of a regular program. So, but this media spotlight drops in as the moral panic's going on, and all of a sudden everyone thinks that, there's this thing. And this is going to happen throughout the rest of the campaign. Yeah, spotlighting example, budget cuts to government agencies. Let's see, trouble. So if there's questions added on that, we're going to go a little bit more into the funding aspect here, because that's a little trickier. But the key thing you need to remember with a moral panic, why do I advise against moral panic? So we're entering the tail end of the campaign, right? Yeah, but it's also the hardest part. This is going to happen a lot. And when the human response to threat, so this is what I actually study for my dissertation, violence and instability. The human biochemical evolutionary response to threat falls into what I call the Ares or Athena approach, or the affective or instrumental predatory. And they come from 2 evolutionary systems. And we're going to talk about the Ares one over here, because this is the one how you respond to a threat. It's how the human body evolved to respond to, there's a bear attacking me, or I think the caveman next door is going to attack me, right? The human body, when it senses a threat, floods the system with these chemicals, adrenaline, and all this stuff. And the effective response, tell me if this starts sounding familiar. It's very emotive. it seeks to perform like an animal, stand up taller, look angrier, look more menacing. It is a performance-based response to threat, because that's the first step you do when you're threatened, is you look big, you get noisy, you get loud. This is animals, humans. It's performance-based, so it's demonstrative. It wants to see, and in humans, because we're social, part of that demonstrative space is it's seeking to bring in allyship from people around you. Hey, look, we're being attacked. Come in and help me fight the bear. So there's a group cohesion effect that occurs, that we are naturally primed to fall for this. The problem is, and this is the interesting part, when you're in this effective response, your chemicals are so high that there's something called a transference. And the transference is when your aggression on the threat transfers to the ally standing next to you. Now, anyone who's been in a bar fight or had to be a bouncer or deal with like physical fighting of an uncontrolled nature know what I'm talking about. It's the random fights that break out seemingly among people who are on the same side. And it's because they're getting in that bubble and inadvertently crossing that trigger of threat when someone's already high prompted on the effective. Now, all of this makes sense genetically when we're talking about physical threats, but when it comes to social media, unless you can physically respond, all that's going to happen is these chemicals start surging and you start doing the performative display. You get really angry. People, you're drawing in support, but if they're not immediately allied in the same way you are, you turn on your allies, you fight. All of this takes energy. And what the cycle is that they don't talk about is there's a collapse after this. Once you have this threat response go through, within, obviously right after there's a drop, but especially 3 to 5 days later, there's a huge chemical drop that puts people in depression. It makes them feel exhausted. It makes them feel tired. Look at any social media, and this applies to the right and the left. I mean, all that nonsense going on about, what's the media paying attention to or not that's going on the right now. They feel it. They're going to have this drop because they get really outraged. They get really upset. And then 3 to 5 days later, they get exhausted and drop. And in a campaign season, as you hit September and October, those drops are where the danger is, because that's when you're no longer your eyes off the ball. We can't afford to get exhausted and tired and tune out or just not be on top of it because we spent all our energy getting. So what I'm kind of trying to say here is, with like things with the mailboxes, do some more due diligence. Use Google News stories to search for articles about this thing to distinguish between a media spotlight. Go back in time, do some extra checking, not just because you want to debunk it or prove it's not true, but to prevent yourself from getting in this effective response that's going to leave you chemically drained and exhausted, 5 days to a week later. There's no time or room to deal with that sort of cycle of up and down, because you may be down at the wrong time when something real happens. And so this gets now into the post office funding question. Now, this is a little bit trickier because I think there's some legitimate concerns here, but the concern was, the general context of this is that the post office being underfunded as an intentional strategy, because the perception by the president is that the there's going to be a big mail-in ballot because of the pandemic. Mail-in ballots favor Democrats. Therefore, the president has been attacking mail-in ballots as a part of delegitimizing the election. Not for nothing, Russia's making the same point because they want to delegitimize elections all over. But what it gets to is this question of the post office. And I've seen a lot of people passing memes around about the post office and its role in the government and how it's funded. And I want to kind of clarify some things from a context standpoint, just to give some baseline, because the post office is kind of a different animal, and there's been some bad reporting out there. So first off, yes, the post office is a constitutionally mandated activity, and it was a department within the United States government, like Department of Defense or Department of Interior or Department of State, up until 1970. 1970, there was a post office strike. And this is not necessarily, I'm going back in time here, but it's key to understand. The conditions for the post office were absolutely atrocious then. What happened is, as the boom happened in the 50s and the 60s, mainly you had black workers were the only ones who were accepted in the post office job. The conditions were horrible. The pay was low. They weren't allowed to unionize or collectively bargain because they were considered federal workers. They weren't allowed. And what happened was a small strike in New York rapidly grew into wildcat strikes, where the unions that didn't have collective bargaining weren't even in control of the strikes. This thing spread, and it was partly related to the civil rights and the racial issues that were going on at the time. And part of the demands were, we want to unionize and be able to bargain. And, you know, Nixon was the president at the time. He said, he threatened everyone, go back to work. And they not only ignored him, but more people went on a strike. Then he sent in the National Guard to deliver the mail. That didn't work. And for 8 days, it literally shut the economy down. Finally, they came to an agreement. And coming out of this was a law which reorganized the post office. And this is key to understand now, because how it reorganized it was as an independent agency. The post office is a self-funded agency. Its debts are owed by the government, but its funding comes from its own operations. And it was organized as a corporation. This is the part that I think a lot of people don't get. They're like, this isn't like any other part of the government. There are parts of the government, especially in independent agencies, that act more like corporations than they do federal agencies, not from a profit standpoint, but the way they're structured. And part of that reorganization, you know, the trade-off was the post office workers could get unions, they could collectivize, they could collectively negotiate. This wasn't, you know, there was wins on both sides. But you've got to now understand, from 1970 to 2006, there are pension requirements, because this is the big thing that people are getting into, that are building. But the post office, because it's got this weird structure, hasn't paid anything into its pension fund. This is pointed out in GAO reports and OMB reports as a risk. And in 2006, a bill gets passed, the Post Office Accountability and something Enforceability Act. And part of that is the context for the funding here. That bill says that to jumpstart the medical and retirement funding benefits, the post office has to pay in 10 years of funding, and then they can amortize out for 40 years. It basically brought the post office funding mechanism in line with other federal agencies. There's two agencies here, the Civil Service Retirement System, CSRS, and the Federal Employment Retirement System, FERS. These are the agencies that determine how pensions are funded, and their general rule of thumb is, and this is why you're gonna hear these numbers, they calculate the obligation for 75 years. Now, an obligation is not the same as a cash payout. An obligation is an accounting number that says this is what your obligation is to fund. Then they say you can amortize that 75-year calculation over a 40-year amortization plan. So it's kind of like a mortgage, right? You're paying a piece of that 75 every 40 years. The post office, because it didn't have anything in the pension fund, had these really steep fees they had to pay in to basically buy into and start getting up. And this was going to happen from 2006 to 2016, 10 years, at which point the 40-year amortization would kick in. And it was a very heavy fee at the time. I mean, I'm not discounting this, but a lot of people are saying that they had to pay 75 years in advance. It's not true. It's a calculation obligation. And what happened is they only made those payments through 2012. So to the extent that the post office has a problem with funding now, it has nothing to do on a cash standpoint with medical or retiree benefits, because those haven't been paid since 2012. And you can check this out if you read the 10K. A 10K is an annual report for a corporation. The post office, as a corporation, has a 10K. I've linked the 2019 one in there. And they basically lay out that they are now in the amortization period, and they say, for 2019, 2018, 2017, OPM has billed us $1.6 billion, $1.4 billion, and $1.7 billion for this CSRS amortization payments due. We're not paying it because if we paid it, we think we would put our operations in jeopardy. So they're putting a position out that we're not paying into this fund because it would cause our existing operations to suffer. They also are supposed to pay into FERS, the other one, the FERS, which deals with the medical benefits, $1.1 billion, $958 million, $917 million. Anyways, every year the post office doesn't make these payments. So they're not paying anything into pension, medical, or retirements. And that's a little tricky. People like, if you were a corporation, you wouldn't have to pay all 75 years at once. That's true, but no one pays 75 years at once. They pay it over a 40-year amortization. And right now, there are no payments going in. And even if payments were going in, they aren't enough to explain the losses that are going on. So when I looked at the unfunded amounts that they're not paying, you're talking about close to $1 billion to $2 billion a year. Those two numbers I gave you are the amount they would pay for the 40-year amortization. Their net operating loss is closer to $8 to $9 billion. So there's a delta between even if we say, and I'm not saying the funding mechanism is legitimate or not. Let me get to that in a second. if the funding mechanism was the problem, the $2 billion they have to pay per year in funding would be roughly equivalent to the loss. The loss is about 4 times the funding requirement. So that's not the only reason why the funding is struggling. And I think a lot of these details are missed when people are talking about the post office. The post office has been declining ever since the internet came around. In 1970, when that strike happened, it shut the economy down. If a strike happened today, I don't know if we'd miss a beat. Yes, people would suffer. Yes, people wouldn't be able to get stuff, but it wouldn't shut the economy down because there's no more paper bills don't go out through the post office. A lot of stuff is online and virtual these days. You know, obviously emails, all these things happening. And some of this is Congress's fault. Even though it's an independent agency, the post office, like one of the things that happened in 2006 is they were going to say, we're not going to deliver on Saturday because that's not profitable. And, you know, Congress is like, whoa, you can't not deliver on Saturday in my district. I'm going to hear about it. You have to deliver on Saturday. So I think now as we shift to a talk of reform, completely aside from the 2020 election, the post office needs to be reformed badly. It's got to have, Congress has to make a decision of to what extent the post office is going to be able to manage delivery. Maybe because last mile delivery in rural areas is expensive and not profitable, maybe Congress provides a subsidy for that, just like they do with the phone taxes. If you're old enough to remember the phone tax where you had to pay a fee on your phones for supplying phone access to rural areas, maybe it's something like that. Maybe they give some more flexibility in how they're structuring services. There's going to be a negotiated settlement on this funding for pensions. I see this all the time with like the DOD basically doesn't want to do something. It takes this negotiating position and say, we're not going to comply with what we're required to do. And here's this reason, but what we're really hoping to do is Congress to come back and fix it. And that's what the post office has done on the pension funding since about 2012 on. Now, none of this has to do with the election funding and, you know, but I think it's the context to understand that even if you go back this time last year, and this is why with all these campaign stories that go back, use Google search and set your parameters to January 1st, 2020 or 2 years ago. You will see that these discussions of fundings and cost overruns or financial challenges of the post office have been going on for a long time. Then on top of that, the pandemic comes in. And I've actually linked, there's a link in the article where the pandemic, they were describing that because of the pandemic, there will be delays in mails because they're trying to be safer. They got to be safer for the workers. This was in April that this was issued. It's not related at all to the election, but then suddenly Trump jumps in with the delegitimizing the mail. Now there's a lot of concerns. What's also getting this riled up is a post office letter went out to 46 states saying, if you're one of these 46 states, your mail might not be delivered in time. And what that is that's not saying that if you, at any point in the mail-in for mail-in ballots, it might not be delivered. It's identifying states that have a last chance to mail very close to the election. You know, the election's November 3rd. If you've got a mail-in date that says you can mail your ballot in Pennsylvania, I think by October 26 or 28, that's only leaving a few days to get in time. So the post office, these letters, this warning letter was not all your mail-in ballots are at risk. It's saying if your acceptable date of where you cut off that people can mail is so close to the election, we're not going to hit that window. We're warning you now that that's a risk. Now, all of this stuff I just said may be water under the bridge because Congress has come back, hammered the president really hard. The president himself has flip-flopped and said he'll support it. And there may be some sort of reconciliation to stop all activities, whether they were routine or dastardly, stop all removal, stop all locking, stop the removal of the mail sorters and the cost, stop all those things till after the election. And honestly, I don't mind that, right? I can live with that. There was $25 billion allocated. Look, the pandemic, there was already $25 billion allocated for the post office in the very first stimulus negotiation back in April, March. It didn't get funded, but just like I said earlier, there's a crater. The post office, yeah, 25 billion, great. Give them the 25 billion. It's a crater. We need to fill it. This isn't me saying I think the post office is going to have a long and healthy future after the election. I'm just saying for the purposes of the election, put a pause on all this stuff right now, whether it was conspiracy or just routine, doesn't matter. The optics are terrible. Put it behind us and move on and deal with it after the election. That's where I sit on that. Yep. So I see there's a hearty debate. Yeah, there's a debate about Amazon, and this is good because this is one of the things. Would it shut Amazon down? Amazon, if you've noticed, has been building its own fleet of van service drivers to deliver. I don't know if this was in relation to the post office or some sort of long-term plan. They're also building a drone fleet to deliver packages, drone delivery packages. So I think the trend over time, that last mile delivery problem is either going to be solved by gig drivers and fleets of gig drivers or drones or some combination thereof of the two. I don't think it's a natural impossibility, but I think we're seeing kind of like when Netflix started doing DVDs by mail and people are like, wait, I don't have to go to Blockbuster anymore. The mechanism by which that last mile gets delivered, there's a lot of innovation going on in that area, and we're going to see how it plays out. I don't think, unless Congress allows the post office some flexibility, I don't think the post office is in a good spot because they're just going to be in the continuing position they are now, where their rates are capped and they can't adjust their rates even if the delivery is more expensive. Yeah, Rory's mentioning PO boxes in town are the delivery method of many rurals. It's not like the UPS vehicles is driving 10 miles down a dirt road all over the country. It depends, Rory. I've been out in rural Nevada, and it depends on the local post office. It really does vary by area. And so, but some rural areas they used to have central pickup areas where you would all go and get your mail in the central area. It may be returned to something like that. It may not. But I'm just trying to say that right. A lot of people, and people brought up medication. Medication is a valid point. There's a lot of delivery of medication, but I'm just saying the post office is continually losing money. So I am in favor of stopping all the removals, get them to 25 billion. Go out and buy stamps, whatever you want. That's not going to save the post office this time next year. In fact, it may hasten its decline to accelerate it in terms of the election. I think the election is more important ultimately right now in if I got to balance things, but just keep in mind these issues won't go away just because the election happens. They're going to be long-term issues that the Congress will need to solve. And again, I'm not opposed to reform. If Congress wants to loosen up the restrictions on the post office, make some of those changes, that's fine. But the point of the context I wanted to provide was to show how we got here today was a multi-generational problem built up over decades. Trump walks in, sticks his foot in it, obviously stirs the pot, but that guy hasn't stayed consistent, since Syria. He flip-flopped and backed away from it. So I think with the post office, it's just something that I see a lot of these memes, and this is kind of probably maybe the last one of these are going to do. The whole post office thing blew up and was really important for a week or two. It's probably not going to be important in 2 weeks because something else is going to blow up. And this is where I go back to that moral panic and effective threat response. If you don't double check and triple check your sources and stories and things like that, you're going to get caught in, and it's happening on the red and the blue with increasing frequency. You're going to get caught in this cycle, and what it's going to do is harm yourself with mental health repercussions more than anything else. This chemical cycle with this effective response where we feel we're under threat, like I said, I saw people ready to go out and pick up arms because they thought the post office boxes were being removed. Mind you, wouldn't have been a bright idea. They didn't know how to use them. I don't think they had any anyways, but especially as we go into campaign season. Portland, Lafayette, there are legitimate concerns. We need to keep sharp for those ones and be able to sort the noise from the signal. And so I'll pause here to see if there's any more questions. Yeah, Trisha is saying that's the story with everything these days. Problems accumulated over time, and then Trump sticks his foot in it. I mean, for anyone who's been reading with me since 2001 when I started doing this, we've discussed governmental problems. I almost think I could go back sometimes, and the same list that we were talking about then is the same list now. Everyone, I think we're at the top of the hour, and so we're going to, unless I see more questions, again, check out Patreon if you haven't yet, www.patreon.com/infomullet. I am going to take a break because I have been working for about 46 days straight, so I may not be online that much the next couple of days, but we'll be back, again, 2 weeks. We'll be back the first Wednesday of the month. So first Wednesday in September, we'll be back on live with an Ask Me Anything, and we'll see what great new disaster has befallen us or angry, Swedish, provoking research I can share. Other than that, everyone have a good day. Stay inside if you can. If you can't, wear a mask and take care of yourself. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a muleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.